Hello and welcome to another video on the Skripting tutorial channel. Yeah, I do realize it's been about 4 or 5 months, but take what you can get. In today's video, we're going to be creating a custom warp command, so setwarp, delete warp. So let's get right into the code. First, we're going to do command setwarp, and then we're going to have an argument, which is going to be text, and only admins are going to be able to run this command. So we're going to do permission. Our permission can just be something like warp.setwarp, it doesn't really matter. Trigger, and then set, and we're going to create a variable called warp, and then arg1, because our warp variable is going to contain the name of the warp. To player's location, this is going to store the coordinates of the player's location into this variable, and then Skript lets you teleport people to the location, so we can say teleport to the variable. And then just say send new warp arg1 created at location player's location. Now for the delwarp command, we also want to add a text argument, permission warp.delwarp. Obviously we only want admins to be able to delete a warp. Trigger delete warp arg1. You probably do want to add a condition in here to check if the warp actually exists, but that doesn't really matter at this moment. Send warp arg1 deleted. So maybe if you mess up a warp or just don't want a warp to be there anymore, you can delete the warp. So now for our warp, command warp, we also want a text argument here so we can specify what warp. We don't want any permission. Obviously you can add a permission, but anyone on the server is going to be able to use the command, so we don't need to add permission. Trigger. And because players are actually going to be using this command, we do want to add a condition. If warp arg1 is set, and then else, so we'll just use that else after, teleport player to warp arg1, send warping to arg1, and then if the warp doesn't exist, if that variable that we created up here doesn't exist, send this warp does not exist. And you can do the exact same for up here in the del warp and even in the set warp if you don't want to override a warp. I've said warp so many times it doesn't even sound like a word anymore. And for our warp list, it's going to be slightly different, so no arguments needed. Trigger. We could just loop, or we could just print warp and then an asterisk here. That would actually show what the variable contains, which we don't want. We actually want the warp name. So we're going to do loop warp, and then that, and then send the loop index, I believe it is. If not, we'll fix that in a wee second. You reload that. That's just a warning that doesn't concern us. So we can do set warp new warp. Okay, new warp created. And now if we run away, warp new warp, it teleports us here. And obviously you can make this much prettier. You can also do del warp new warp. And then if I try and warp to it, it doesn't work. Let's create a new warp. So if I do warp list, it does work. So we just created a new warp called A there, and we do warp list, and it's there if we do. And then warp list. See, it's there. So if you did find this tutorial useful, please like and subscribe.